Strategic ambiguity is when a state practices or follows two seemingly different foreign policy tracks simultaneously. And in some cases, those different tracks may, in fact, on the surface anyway, appear to be contradictory. But what strategic ambiguity allows states to do is to pursue a much more subtle, much more nuanced foreign policy. And it's practiced by many states that are skillful at using diplomacy, because oftentimes diplomacy, without at least the threat of force, is not particularly effective. And the threat of force without diplomacy is oftentimes reckless. So states do practice strategic ambiguity by following different approaches, different tracks, different channels, different currents of their foreign policy in order to buy themselves flexibility, dealing with threats or opportunities. And it also gives the international system a bit more elasticity, allows it to breathe, and allows conflict mitigation to take place more effectively. The US really, in some ways, pioneered the notion of strategic ambiguity. During the Cold War, unrelated to the Middle East in particular, during the Cold War, it pursued really two different tracks. It used the specter of force and the threat of force against the Soviet Union in its commitment with NATO and of its forward-leaning posture, but it also pursued détente, right? So it combined two seemingly contradictory foreign policy tracks, but it worked together to develop a more balanced foreign policy. In the Middle East in particular, the US was able to pursue strategic ambiguity by positioning itself as an honest broker, or at least a plausible broker, in peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and Syria at different times. It did that. At the same time, it was this more balanced broker. Its clear loyalty was to the state of Israel. But the fact that it was able to do both of those things allowed it to both pressure Israel at times, pressure Israel's adversaries at times, and in the absence of any other actor that could play this role, the US was able to do that. In my recently released book, Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy, I actually demonstrate and show how Iran developed over time the notion of strategic ambiguity in its foreign policy. So the two various tracks that were seemingly contradictory to one another that Iran pursued was it pursued its alliances and its support for militias like the Hashd-e-Shaabi in Iraq, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. It was working in the shadows, actually challenging Saudi Arabia's position in the region and challenging the sovereignty of states in the region, while at the same time it was pursuing diplomacy with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. And in the preparation or in the research for my book, when I met with two Iranian presidents and a number of different foreign ministers, here's how they defended it. They defended this strategic ambiguity, saying that the support for militias, the sort of shadowy foreign policy, was a strategy not of choice but necessity, because they needed that in order to create deterrence, in order to execute their doctrine of forward defense. And their strategy of, or their policy of pursuing diplomacy with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so forth, that was a strategy of choice. That's where they wanted to go. That's how they defended the seemingly contradictory paths. That strategic ambiguity died after October 7th, after Hamas attacked Israel, because shortly after that, the Iranians doubled down on their support for Hezbollah, doubled down on their support for the Hashd-e-Shaabi, the Houthis, and even Hamas. At least rhetorically, they doubled down on that. And so what they were now not able to deny is the fact that this was not necessarily a strategy of necessity. It was a strategy of choice, in a way, that they had chosen to take a confrontational stance with Israel. It wasn't just about defense. So that then ran into contradiction. It contradicted their policy of diplomacy with Saudi Arabia and the United States. It complicated the strategic environment for Iran. It didn't help their strategic environment at all. So they lost strategic ambiguity. And the United States similarly lost strategic ambiguity. We thought prior to the 12-day war, or in the early days of it, even the early days of the 12-day war, we thought the United States might play a constructive role, perhaps, even though they apparently gave Israel a green light. They could play a constructive role, not necessarily fall into the notion of bombing Iran, but would play a diplomatic role and pursue negotiations with Iran. Once the United States actually committed to bombing Iran, bombing the nuclear sites of Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow, they now also, it was very, very clear, they were not a plausible broker. They were not a mitigator of conflict. They were a protagonist. They were a contributor to the conflict. The United States has now removed the veil of any impartiality, any real desire for diplomacy. So it makes the Iranians much more distrustful of the United States, and it makes it much more difficult for Iran to pivot. It matters because now the situation is much more brittle, and the likelihood of having conflict mitigation measures be effective has been reduced substantially. I think the U.S. could resurrect that with a more nuanced foreign policy. The United States does use its good offices to create a diplomatic track and work with our Gulf Arab allies. There is an opportunity, perhaps, for diplomacy, using this crisis to advance diplomacy. Whether that's in the cards in this administration is obviously questionable. And the Iranians, too, I think, can advance from where they are today, assuming that they can reconstitute their leadership team in order to be able to conduct a reasonable foreign policy. They too, not so much in relations with the United States perhaps, but certainly in doubling down on their newly improved relationship with the Gulf Arab states, principally Saudi Arabia, they too perhaps can resurrect a diplomatic track. And they will have to then figure out whether their strategy of backing their militias is contradictory, is actually a part of strategic ambiguity, or whether it undermines their diplomacy going forward.